Welcome to the Conscious Dominance Podcast, where Andrew and Eric, two dominant men in dom-sub relationships, discuss how we approach our dominant roles from a conscious and loving place, and what we learn about ourselves through the deep intimacy that these power exchange dynamics make possible. Sit back and enjoy the show. Welcome to the Conscious Dominance Podcast. My name's Andrew, and today I'm hosting a solo episode because my good friend Eric suffered a bit of a mishap. So this week I decided to record a solo episode. And the reason I wanted to do this is I've spent the better part of the last 3 years of my life as a coach, mentor, teacher, educator for men who want to be dominants in dom-sub relationships, and for women who want to be submissives in dom-sub relationships. And when you do this for a living, there tends to be some assumptions that people make about what this is for me and what kind of person I am, that this is maybe something that I've always been or that I've always been a part of, and that it comes naturally to me. And what I want to do today with this solo episode is just spend some time kind of sharing my journey in dominance and in BDSM and in kink and in these dom-sub relationships, to really give an authentic reflection of what this is for me, where it came from, and how I got to be where I am today, which is really a place that I'm very proud of. I'm proud of myself. I'm proud of my wife and my submissive Dawn. I'm proud of everything that we've created together, including our business, including our relationship, including this podcast that I do here with Eric, and everything else. I take a lot of pride in it because there's been a lot of intentionality, and frankly, I've had to work for it. And this isn't something that's come naturally to me. This is something that I've had to really battle through a lot of my own demons, a lot of my own challenges, my own just shit from the past, my pain, to really be able to live this in an authentic way. Because when I make my living as a teacher, as an educator, as a coach, as a mentor, it's of the utmost importance to me that I'm teaching from a place of authenticity. And in order to do that, I have to be really in integrity to myself. And so a part of sharing this story with you today is an opportunity for me to really reflect with full integrity where I am as a dominant and where I came from. So to start this story, I really have to go all the way back probably to my late teenage years. It was when AOL chat rooms and the earliest of early bulletin boards on the internet happened. I'm 43 years old. I'll be 44 here soon. And I've had the internet in my life since I was about 15. And like most people did back then, the internet was a place of discovering all kinds of things that you didn't even know existed, especially growing up in a small town, growing up in a farm, rural, out in the country, not even really interacting with a lot of people. So internet access was like this gateway to the outside world that I hadn't had up until that point in my life. And it really did open my eyes, even as a young man, to what was out there, what was possible in relationships. Because up until this point in my life, all I had really been able to witness in terms of relationships was the one between my parents, which was dysfunctional, and the relationships of extended family, friends, neighbors, none of which was anything that I would ever want to replicate. But I didn't know any different until I was able to start seeing what else was out there and what else was possible. And so from a very young age, I was drawn to both stories, writing, porn, everything that had to do with power exchange, really from the very earliest times that I started exploring these things. And that was made possible by dial-up internet and waiting 5 minutes for a text page to open so you could read something. The things that I saw there that intrigued me so much, it was never for me about the specifics of things like bondage or sadism, masochism. It was never about that. It was always something about the connection between the two people. It was always something about the kind of trust, because I never had trusting relationships modeled to me. And there was something really deeply powerful about the trust that a submissive would need to have in order to give herself to a dominant in the way that I was seeing. And again, dramatizations, porn, who knows how realistic any of this was. But there was something for me that I always felt called to, that I felt interested in and curious about because of that trust. The trust the submissive granted to the dominant, yes, but also the trust that the dominant would have to have in the submissive. There was a lot of give and take in that, and it was that connection that always called out to me. And I think in part that was most likely because I didn't experience relationships that had deep connection. I didn't experience relationships that had deep trust. And I craved something about that. It really did something that activated something in me. And so, like a lot of people do, when you find your thing, when it comes to kink, porn, turn-ons, whatever, you kind of follow that thread and keep looking at it and expanding on it and understanding it. And the other thing that was always really interesting to me about dominant submissive sorts of dynamics that I would read about, that I would watch, experience, was the trust also that it took for both dominant and submissive to be able to explore their full range with each other. Now, I didn't know that at the time when I'm a teenager, when I'm in my early 20s and starting to just be curious about this stuff. But in retrospect, there's really something about even back then that called to me about the ability to be and bring all of yourself into a relationship that has so much passion and intensity and trust that always called to me. But at the same time, I never, ever spoke up for this. And my history of dating, I had a couple of not serious girlfriends in high school. I had one girlfriend in college, and then I got married at 21 years old to my first wife. And everything that I had ever discovered about myself, my own sexuality, my own desires, my own curiosities, I pushed them down. There most certainly was shame. There were patterns of sexual repression from things I went through in my childhood. There were all sorts of different reasons why. And I don't really think it matters that much, the why. But the reality was I didn't speak up for any of this, for my desires, for my curiosities. And I just pushed them down and I hid them. And this hiding ended up causing me a lot of problems throughout my life because that then became a pattern. The bigger this desire got, the more I had to push it down, the more I had to suppress it, the more I had to hide it. And that just left the tension between my real life as I went through like my first marriage and the desires that I had hidden in the background that were unspoken and therefore unfulfilled. The distance between what I wanted in a relationship, that passion, intensity, trust, kink, and then the relationship I was living, which was one of suppression and repression and resentment and unmet needs. And of course, we were young. so we didn't know any better and everything else. But the farther that those two things got away from each other, the more I even started to shut off my own connection to what it was that I wanted. And I stopped even letting myself admit it. Now I'd still look at the porn. I would still read about it, but I would never anymore admit that I would actually want this kind of thing in a relationship. I just shut that down. I shut it down completely. And I guess almost assumed that it was impossible that you could ever actually have that kind of a thing in real life. Because again, growing up in a small town and then getting married really young to someone who was not adventurous, but felt very safe, to the part of me that wanted a safe relationship, that was looking for some safety and certainty in my life, but it didn't even feel possible based on my life's experience. And because it felt so impossible, I really just found myself pushing it down even more, suppressing it more, and essentially assuming that there was no way that I could ever actually have the kind of relationship that I really wanted, that I craved, that I desired. And that also came up and came out in ways that I would really repress any desire to be in charge. Because a part of what I found so intriguing and interesting about dominant submissive dynamics was this idea that the dominant could take the lead in a way that made a better experience for both himself and his submissive. That it was possible that when one person was leading and the other person was following, that both people could have a better experience of life. That was something that I deeply, deeply desired. And at the same time, again, never spoke up for. As I matured through my 20s, especially, I became pretty successful in my career. I started one business and sold it, started another one that was taking off and doing really well. And I was in a really good place in my life. And I had some tendencies of leadership and dominance and taking charge and taking control. But I would take those when they were available, when they were easy, when they were offered to me. But I also, that pattern of repression and suppression and not speaking up for myself really kept me from ever stepping forward into taking charge in situations where I knew that if things went the way that I wanted them to go, that they would be better for everyone involved. This meant in my first marriage. It also played out in business. It played out in every area of my life. And I still just had this massive tension, this massive distance between what I thought was possible and what I was living and experiencing. And in all of that, I just continued to try to play the good guy. I tried to do the right thing, to do the good thing, to do what would please and make other people around me happy. I played out some pretty heavy duty people pleasing and codependency traits. And those still existed beside parts of me that were very much in charge, in the lead and control. But when it came to interacting with other people, I really had a very deep discomfort with telling anyone else what to do. Even if telling them what to do was for their good, for their benefit. And that was a trait that was, fast forward into current reality, that's been something that I've had to work through in the 5.5 years that Dawn and I have been in a 24/7 Dom sub dynamic. I've had to work really hard to be able to step up and to take charge in that way, to take the lead, even when I know She wants me to, I want to, and doing so makes everything better. It's still been tough because those patterns go so far back for me. And the reality was back then, I wanted this dom sub dynamic. I fantasized about it. I imagined it. I couldn't let myself admit it. But the truth was, I was not ready for it. I did not have the inner strength that I needed. And if I would have found myself in a dom sub dynamic from such a repressed state of self, I would not have been able to handle it. I would not have been able to take charge and tell anyone else what to do, how to be, how to live their life, to lead or guide or control anything in a healthy way. I couldn't have. I wasn't equipped, because what I've come to learn and understand is that when a dominant approaches dominance from a place where he's not healed and whole and okay inside of himself, if he finds himself in a position of being in control or being in charge, the decisions that get made are not in the best interest of his submissive. They're in the best interest of his ego. They're in the best interest of helping him avoid pain. They're in the best interest of fulfilling his unmet needs. And this very quickly becomes untenable for any relationship, because the only way that could ever even be acceptable is if the submissive is completely in abandonment of her own self. Because I believe that women are blessed with the ability to see and feel and know the truth. And whether or not the man in their life is living in the truth, or if he's living in some sort of wounding, if he's living in some sort of weakness. I would not have been ready to be a dominant back then. But the problem was, rather than investing in learning what I needed to become inside of myself in order to have that kind of a relationship, I just ignored it. I didn't believe that it was ever possible, and I just kept pushing it down to the point that in some part of my first marriage breaking apart, a part of that fell on me for not speaking up and taking charge of my own desire. And I had so much resentment built up. I had so much frustration. I had so much unhappiness. And I was so unfulfilled by that relationship that I blamed the relationship. And she blamed me for things. I blamed her for things. We both were pretty immature in it all. And eventually that relationship broke. And in reality, all of the things that I wanted, all of the things that I desired, might have been possible in that relationship. I don't know. I'll never know. But I do know that there was no chance. There was absolutely no opportunity for that relationship to thrive and flourish in hindsight, because I never spoke up. And I just blamed her for not giving me what she didn't even know I wanted and needed. Because I wouldn't admit to myself what I wanted. I wouldn't admit to myself what I needed, because I was afraid of upsetting her. I was afraid of being turned down. I was afraid of being rejected. I was afraid of being left. I was afraid. I was just terrified. So then Dawn and I met, and we started dating. And we've said this in a recent podcast, or Dom Sub Devotion podcast, that we had almost a natural Dom Sub dynamic at the beginning of our relationship. In part, probably because I was her boss. And She was my employee. We had worked together for a year and a half. She was essentially my assistant. So we worked side by side for a year and a half with really no sparks. No, honestly, there was nothing there romantically between us until there was. But in part because of that power imbalance, I guess you would say. And in part because of who I felt like I maybe had the opportunity to become in being out of that first relationship, and in part because of who Dawn is and what her spirit really is. There's something about her that activated a part of me, a part of that suppressed desire to be in the lead and to be in charge. And like, I know the beginnings of all relationships are that new relationship energy is intense and it's hot, but holy shit, the beginning of our relationship was something else. And it showed me something, a piece, like it was like a glimpse behind the curtain of all of the things that I had ever thought was possible between a man and a woman that I was experiencing with her. And I never wanted to live without that again. It was the first time I had ever felt it. All of those things I talked about earlier, that trust, that passion, that intensity, the freedom, it was all there. And as our relationship progressed and old patterns started to kick in, some of her religious programming, some of my patterns of suppression, the all of the different things that we had learned, absorbed, and come to believe about what love and relationship and long-term relationships were. We had this great hot start, and then it just kind of fizzled. And it felt like something was slipping through my fingers. It felt like something that I could not grasp it was disappearing, and I was losing something very important. And it kind of wrecked me when things got stale, because I'd been there before and I didn't want to go back there, especially after tasting and seeing what was possible between she and I. And at this point, now I'm in my 30s, I'm in my early 30s. I did try at times to speak up for what it was that I wanted. But this is where we got into a dynamic between she and I, where I got needy because I wasn't confident in what I wanted. I wasn't solid. I didn't believe that I was worthy of it. I had all sorts of my own shit that I was carrying. And then she had hers. She had her beliefs. She had her own suppression. We both had our own traumas that we hadn't dealt with from our childhoods. And all of these things just kind of played out in this dynamic that began to and continued to really develop over our first 8 years of marriage, where I would try to speak up for what I needed. She would get triggered by the fact that I needed it. She would eventually lash out because, in her words, um, she felt a lot of shame for not living up to my desires, because she put a lot of pressure on herself to perform and to be the good girl and to do it right. This was her perfectionism that she's had to battle through and work through a lot. And also, because I was so messed up on the inside, because I hadn't dealt with the things that had happened to me in my childhood, I hadn't processed and let go of the beliefs that I absorbed and created for myself about relationships because of the relationship I saw between my parents. So I was fighting for something more between us, but it was coming from such a an untrue place. When I say untrue, I don't mean that it was false. I just mean it was not solid. It wasn't, I wasn't confident in it. I didn't really believe in it. I was just trying to get something for myself. And that's what neediness really is. It's not needy to have needs. It's needy to be manipulative and backhanded and sneaky about the ways that we try to get those needs met rather than just speaking up for them. So I got needy, she withdrew, and we ended up in a relationship that was better than my first one. It was friendly. It was enjoyable. We liked each other. But I still had all of this desire for more of what that thing was that we had touched at the beginning. And I still had all of these fantasies about dominance and submission and BDSM and kink. And when I say BDSM, again, for me, this has never been about the heavy physical kinks. I know that's it for a lot of people. That's really never what it's been about for me. This has always been about the more mental side of kink. It's been about the more control and surrender side of kink and less about the physical. Like bondage stuff, S&M stuff is just, it's never been my thing. But I still wanted that connection, that dynamic, that trust, that intensity. And it was just so fucking hard for me to speak up for. And the few times that I did, it came out so needy that it was just not even possible that it could ever have felt good to her to go along with any of it. So we came to a point in our relationship about 2014 where some things had happened in our personal life that essentially took our free time that we had together and nuked it. And so now our relationship that had already been kind of going downhill and sideways and had gotten pretty flat, now we had lost the thing that we had, that we still had going for us, which was the time that we had to spend together with just the two of us. So now we had her kids with us 100% of the time. She couldn't work anymore. I fired her from working for me at that point because she was so overrun and burned out with having her kids full time that working full time, there was just nothing at all left of her. So I'd taken on more at work. I'd taken on the financial responsibility of raising her kids so she could stay home and take care of them and deal with custody challenges and legal things around that she was dealing with. And we really started to falter in our connection. And this is where I started to feel that tension again between what I wanted and what I was experiencing. But there was something in me that knew that she and I had what it took to have this thing that I wanted, to have this intensity, to have this passion, to have this connection. There was something in me that knew that if it was possible to do this, that I could do it with her because we'd experienced it before. And I knew that if I were to just leave her and start over with someone else, that sure, I could probably start out hot and heavy with someone new, but the problems that existed in that relationship at that point were not all her. There were some of them that were me. And I wasn't going to give up on this relationship that had already shown me that it held the potential to be what it was that I desired, until I had done everything that I could do to make sure that I was my best, and that I had given everything I could to lead her and us to a better place. And so this led me to a whole new approach to my life. It started in 2014. I read a few books that really changed my life at that point of my life. One of them was by a guy named Harry Brown, who's passed away since, in I believe the early 2000s. But the book of his that I read was called How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World. And this book, probably more than any other, changed my life. I also read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And I read Mating in Captivity by Esther Perel at some point in the period between probably 2014, 15, 16. And I really started to look at myself, at my history, at my past, at what's the role that I played in my own life, and in why parts of my life weren't going the way that I wanted them to. I've shared this quite a few times before, but during this period of my life, I also got really fat. Between when Dawn and I met and now this period of time, we're talking about probably 5 or 6 years, I'd put on 80, 90 pounds. And it's funny that it took me a long time to realize that had anything to do with why the sex wasn't good anymore. But I didn't want to see that at that point. I really became very introspective, and I became very committed to sorting out what it was that was going on inside of me that kept me from having the life that I wanted to have. I came across a great quote today by Norm Macdonald. Said, "It's the greatest gig in the world being alive. You get to eat at Denny's, wear a hat, whatever you want to do." And I love Norm Macdonald. I always loved his comedy because it was just so absurd and so silly. I realized that life really is an opportunity to do it your own way. And how much of my life had become going through the motions and filling up buckets that I had set there for myself, that I had made these commitments and I'd given myself all of these obligations and a whole life that just demanded of me and demanded of me and demanded of me. And I felt out of control and completely controlled by the things that I had to do to fulfill commitments I made in the past. And this was everything from debt to organizations to which I belonged. It was the the big house that we had built and everything that it took to maintain and upkeep a big home on a big piece of property. It was family obligations. It was everything in my life from the moment that I woke up until the moment that I went to sleep. My life was spoken for. It was gone. I did not have moments of time that belonged to me. And when I realized that my life was not my own, my life was just doing shit for other people, but not because I was a victim, because I had made the choices, I started making different choices. I started choosing to live differently. I made a plan to get out of debt. And at this point, I owned a bunch of rental property. I owned a business. We had built a house a couple of years before. We had car loans. We had a lot of debt. We had a lot of debt at this point. And that debt required a lot of me. So I made a plan to get out of debt completely. It was a long plan. It was a slow plan, but I made a plan to get out of debt because I didn't want my life run and controlled by that. I made plans to quit the all of the organizations to which I belonged that didn't feel good to me, which ended up being almost all of them. This was a New Year's Day resolution in 2015. And on January 2nd, I called and resigned from chambers of commerce, networking groups, nonprofit organizations, boards that I was a part of. I quit a lot of things because I needed to carve out some time in my life for me. And so I just stopped a lot of things so I could start over. I could start building from the ground up. And I also, in April, May of 2015, at close to 300 pounds, which is, 80 pounds heavier than I am right now, I decided to join CrossFit. And CrossFit changed my life, no doubt. Not necessarily just because it had to be CrossFit, but it was the intensity and the combined with the connections that I built with the people there that really drove me to a new commitment to take care of myself, to push myself harder, to do hard things rather than seek comfort and take the easy way out. And so through all of this, I just began to overhaul my life. And this culminated in me coming to a point where I realized that if I was ever going to have the relationship that I wanted, and I've always valued my marriage, my primary relationship, even in my first marriage, I put everything I had into that. Now, I didn't have the same skills that I have now. I didn't have the same maturity I have now, but I put everything into it that I could because it mattered to me. And if I was ever going to have the relationship that I wanted with Dawn, which looked more like what we had at the beginning, that I was going to have to speak up for my needs. I was going to have to pull this part of myself that I had suppressed at this point now we're talking into 2017, 2018, that I'd known was there and that I'd been pushing down for a good 25 years or close to it. That I was going to have to bring this out of the darkness and speak up for it because it was so essential to me, my desire, my sexuality, and what I saw as possible and desirable in a relationship between myself and a woman. If I didn't speak up for that, if I didn't honor that, if I didn't allow myself to pursue what I really wanted, from this place of really, at this point, I'd spent several years working on myself. I'd spent several years getting myself in shape, cleaning up my financial situation, starting to deal with some of my inner crap. Now, there's more of that I had to come later, but at least getting enough clarity so that I could go after what I wanted in relationship with my wife. And also somewhere in this time period, Esther Perel's book that I mentioned, Mating in Captivity, played a part in giving me some language to this, but it gave me this question, like this one burning question that for me has driven and motivated everything that I've done in regards to Dawn's and my relationship, my leadership of it, the dominant submissive dynamic that I introduced and that we created together. This burning question that really started to develop in me was, How do you have deep, close intimacy? Like that really meaningful love and hot, burning, intense passion and desire with the same person. Once I connected to that question, once I connected to that curiosity, because I had never seen it, I'd never seen it done, ever. I'd never seen it possible. I didn't have any evidence that you could actually have a relationship like that. Now I know they exist. Now, back then, I didn't know they existed. I'd never seen one, not in the wild. So this question really started to burn inside of me because I wanted that and I wanted it with her. I knew that we could have it. I knew that if it was possible to do this, at this point now, after having worked on myself and really recognized how much of the problems in our relationship really did fall on me, and not from a position of like self-hatred, blaming myself and just making myself wrong, but seeing how every time I stepped forward, she lightened up, she relaxed, she softened into me. And I recognized or knew on some level that if I could just be my absolute best, that she would also be her absolute best, that she would be right there with me. And I saw that as the answer to the question. I saw that as the answer to how do you have this really close, intimate love and intense, hot, sexy passion with the same person in the same relationship. And so that question really drove me to, in November of 2018, kind of on a whim, in the aftermath of her having read 50 Shades of Grey and really liking it. Now, I came to know later how innocent, how sheltered, how naive Dawn really was, that until she had read that book, she didn't even know what a dominant submissive relationship was. And here I was with 25 years of fantasizing about it. And she had read one book that piqued some interest in her, but not in any way that she desired or sought any of it out in her own life. Just that she enjoyed the book. And don't hate on Dawn for loving 50 Shades of Grey. We have no hatred or negativity towards 50 Shades of Grey in our house. I think that book got a really bad rap because of people seeing it as a dysfunctional BDSM relationship, which it was. But also, I don't think that book was about BDSM. I think it was a redemption story of Christian Grey, because if you read all three books, you see him really evolve and come and work through his inner shit and come into a place of being married and in love and with a child, and they're still in the red room. They're still playing with kink and doing it from a healthier, more embodied way by the end of the third book. And so I look at that more as a redemption story of Christian Grey than I do as a BDSM story. Anyway, got off topic there for a second. She had no clue. She had absolutely no clue what I was talking about. But on a date night out, we were sitting at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. There's a little bar up on, I think, the top floor that look with a window that looks out over the entire skyline and the river. It's just a beautiful, beautiful spot. And we were sitting there having a cocktail, and I just flat out asked her, I want you to be my submissive. I guess I didn't even ask her. I kind of told her, I want you to be my submissive. And her answer to that was, huh? What do you mean? And I was so ill prepared because I asked this question so spontaneously that I had to really quickly go back through 25 years of fantasy, imagination, porn, stories, and all sorts of stuff, fictional, imaginary stuff, and present a case for why she would want to agree to what I was asking her for. And the way that I laid that out to her was about those things I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. It was the desire for relationship that held such deep trust that there could be a full expression of who both people were. That I wanted to lead her. I wanted her to follow me. I used examples from our life of what we did really well. What we did really well when we dated, what went really well at the beginning of our relationship, the places in our relationship where I would lead and she would follow, and things went very smoothly. We were both kind of at our best in those moments. And we ended up having a conversation over the next month. It took her about a month to give me an answer to whether or not she was going to follow me on this. We had some really deep conversations about our relationship, and a lot of these things that I had suppressed for a long time came to the surface, and I had to figure out how to put them into words and to speak up for them. And then she said yes. And then I put a collar on her and we signed a contract. And now I was living this thing. I wasn't ready. I was not ready for what it was going to require of me, because I wasn't just looking for a game here. I was looking for this dynamic, this connection, this leader and follower to become something that allowed me to take us to become the answer to this burning question of deep intimacy, closeness, love, and intensity, passion. And we were pretty good at the closeness, at the intimacy, at the love. We had completely lost the connection to the intensity and passion. But for me, I found myself now being in the position that I had desired to be in for my whole adult life and some of my adolescence. I was unprepared for it, especially for what it was going to require of me in terms of speaking up. Because guess what? These patterns of suppression, these patterns of pushing down my own needs, of not admitting what I wanted, of not saying it out loud, of trying not to upset her, of trying to figure out what she wanted and give it to her. All of these things that I did as a way of relating to women were still there. They were still the same. They never changed. Just because she's wearing a collar. And her patterns were still the same too. We were still the exact same people. But I was now in a position to do something about it. And that is where we started now 5.5 years ago. I'm recording this podcast in May of 2024. This started for us in December of 2018. So it is literally 5.5 years since she put that collar on, and she's been wearing it every day since. And over those 5.5 years, I have still had to continuously challenge my own patterns of repression, of pushing my own needs down, of not speaking up for myself, and for trying not to upset her. Because guess what? If I'm going to be dominant, if I'm going to be in control and lead, it's not always going to be giving her what she wants. And those have been the things that have been the hardest for me. And the desire to be as strong as I could be, as solid as I could be, as confident as I could be, to have a sense of real self-worth, were all things that I realized that I needed if I was going to take her to a place where she could let go enough that the two of us could become what it was that we had touched at the beginning, but to be there, not as a trying to get something back, but as a way that we could live together in both love and passion. And my overarching drive over the last 5.5 years of having this place of authority in our relationship has been to use that authority to set her free and to build a sense of discipline and strength in myself. It has not been to try to control her, to suppress her, to push her down, to make her not do things that upset me. I've actually encouraged her very often to do things that I knew would upset me. But it wouldn't upset me. It would upset the part of me that didn't want to be uncomfortable. Things like learning to hold space for all of her emotions, to allow her to feel everything that she feels, to come into a place of responsibility in my life so that I didn't make her the one who was responsible for my experience. I had to learn to recognize that she is a female, that she operates on a 28 or 29-day cycle, and she's not the same every day, but I am the same every day. So this is where I started tracking her menstrual cycle in 2020. 4 years now. It was May of 2020. So it has been 4 years that I've been tracking her cycle every single day. Every single day. I have not missed a day in 4 years of tracking her cycle and knowing where she's at and really coming to a place of deeper compassion and understanding for her experience as a woman. And all of this has been a journey for me that has brought me to a place where I get to feel such a deep sense of confidence, a deep sense of solidity, a feeling of being truly connected to what's right, being able to live in integrity. It's been a consistent desire and challenge for me to grow, to expand, and to allow her and encourage her to grow and expand, to become more abundant, more free, more alive, more erotic, more everything. And along the way, becoming a teacher, becoming a coach, becoming a mentor for other people, I have had to learn, and I have learned from the people that I've taught. I've learned a lot. I continue to learn, and I continue to realize how much I don't know. But I also really believe in what it is that Dawn and I have created together, and in what our relationship is and what it will continue to become. Because over and through all of this, there was a point that we reached sometime after 2020 where we came up together with this motto, I guess, that we want to see how good this relationship can get. And that for us has meant being willing to continue to grow in the face of uncertainty and discomfort. And I guess that really rounds out for me my journey with dominance, my journey with being a dominant, is that where I have arrived at by taking the inner path, by being willing to work on myself, by being willing to try to be my best self, or the ideal version of myself. Like, that has driven me. And where this all kind of comes together and rounds out is in the fact that what dominance for me is now is seeing how good I can be, how good our relationship can be, how good our dynamic can be, how good our marriage can be, And for her, it's also about how good she can be. And this is not from a place of trying to push ourselves down, but it really is from a place of trying to rise together into our highest expression of love and intimacy and passion and connection. And what I experience now as dominance compared to what I experienced or desired of it through those first 25 years when it was just hidden, now is that I get to experience myself as a man who takes charge and makes things better by taking control of situations, by leading, and by seeing the truth and speaking it. And this is why my view or my approach to dominance is so different than what you and most people will ever see through porn, through stories, through BDSM websites, whatever it might be. My approach is so different because I don't think dominance is something that you do, because with just doing dom things, you never get to the depth of what it means to be dominant, to feel dominant. And nothing in this has ever really been or felt true or right to me until I felt that way about myself. And so dominance for me became about who I was rather than what I did. And it's why we now teach and talk so much about dom sub dynamics from a place of relational skills, not from a place of kink, not from a place of BDSM, not from trying to create porn replicas. Because frankly, that part is really easy when you have two people who are committed to the connection, committed to the dynamic, committed to the relationship. And that's what it has been for us to come into, and for me to come into an authentic, embodied version, or what I call real, true masculinity, has been turning that mirror around instead of pointing fingers and blaming anyone else for anything at all. Becoming dominant on the inside, becoming that solid, that powerful, that disciplined, while also keeping my heart open and being there in complete love and openness and acceptance and receptivity to everything that she is. And this has been my journey with dominance, and where I find myself now in May of 2024 in a place that really kind of blows my mind sometimes. Because not only has my wife worn my collar for 5.5 years, not only have I found the answer to that question that burned and really drove everything that I did for a long time, I get to feel this good every day. I get to feel this good every single day. And that is what dominance really, truly is and means, and what it's become for me in my life, and what I think it makes possible for any person who seeks out these roles. Because it is my absolute true belief that when we desire these kinds of roles, these kinds of power exchange dynamics in relationships, when we have these burning desires that last for our whole lives and don't go away, that they're pointing at a deeper truth about us. They're pointing at something that's more real than we realize. It's more fundamental to who we are. And finding a way to experience them and approach them in a way that is healthy and loving and connected to love and to the heart is worth whatever it takes to get there.